Alright, so this is my upgrades for the Flutter Expense Tracker app. So the first upgrade that I added in was actually a way to actually show the total sum of the price of all the different expenses that's going to be added, and I put it at the bottom of the actual bar chart. The second thing I added was actually showing a different way to display the chart, which is through a pie chart, which color codes each of the different expenses, as well as showing the pie of how much it takes up for the percentage, as well as showing the percentages for each of the different expenses. And I actually made it scrollable using a carousel slider, which when you swipe through allows you to just go through and see the actual animation that's made with the actual pie chart. So when you actually go and add in an extra expense, we'll call it test, make the amount, add in the date, and label it as food. Just as you just have to label it as anything that's not of the ones that was already created. And we save the expense. You can see it updates in the actual bar chart, and it updates in the actual pie chart as well. And it'll actually update all the percentages, making sure that it looks correct. And as you can see in the bottom, it doesn't actually display the new expense that we added, and it's actually scrollable, so that way you can just scroll down and hold and swipe, and you actually see the new expense. And when you actually swipe out one of them, you can see it updates there and actually gets rid of that. So actually for the actual coding, so what was added here was starting out with the final list expenses. This was basically used to actually pass in for the constants using a parameter, because this is how I actually use it to actually get the expenses to actually be displayed. And going down into the chart state, extend into the state chart, this was used to actually manage the state for the expenses. That way to actually be able to use a double to get the total expenses to actually get the total price used. Now going down here, we actually use, this was actually already coded in for the max total expense. So that was used to actually make sure they get the total expenses that was already given. Now this is where I use the set state and set the expenses to 0 at the beginning using a double. And then I use a for loop to actually have it loop through all the widget of the expenses.length. So basically once it loops through all the different expenses that's been added in, it updates total expenses to be it updates it to get through which expenses dot amount, which is actually the double that's actually set for the actual pricing for all the different expenses. So once it goes through and reaches to the end of the expenses list, then it goes and adds up all the different amounts that was added, and that's how I got total expenses to be there. Now actually implementing that into the actual app, this was where I used the text widget inside of the row that was already created, or inside of the actual column, not the row, but the actual column that's already been declared right here. Right here, I just added the text total sum dot, and then I outputted the total expenses and made it to a string just to be able to actually input total sum, which is going to be set as a string. Being able to go to string and implement an actual integer. And this was just where I set the style, including the font weight, and that's how I actually got the total expense to show. Now for the actual pie chart that updates, as well as the scrolling carousel, in the pubspec.yaml file, I included carousel slider as well as the pie chart packages. Those are the packages that I used to actually implement this. So going in, we had the two new imports, the carousel slider as well as the pie chart. So for this, I had to actually create a set state for the actual expenses state, making sure that that returned what I actually needed to do. And in the actual expenses state class, this is where I use it for instance variables. I made a list for the widget for the charts. And the charts was basically just going to be all the different charts that are being used throughout the actual expenses app. Right here, I used a map string, which needed a string and a double for the actual data map. This was for the pie chart, being able to actually show the string that actually showed the name of each of the expenses, as well as the percentage that was used for the inside of the pie chart. So right below here, we have an init state. That's what I used to actually call the object into it. This was where I used another for loop. I just labeled it as I equals 0. And when I is less than the registered expenses, which was already declared from the file already inside the expenses app. The registered expenses dot length was basically just going through the entire expenses that's already been put into after it's been added or however many has been deleted. It increments I. So for that, I used the data map, which calls for a string and a double, which you use the title, which was basically for the string that's used to show like leisure, food, expense, travel. And I set it equal to the actual amount. So whatever amount was set for each title, that's what it set inside the data map, and that's how it set the actual pie chart. Now going down for the add expense, this is where I actually had to add in the data map, because right now it just added in the register expenses. This basically just added it into the bar chart. It didn't actually add it into the pie chart yet. So I actually had to add data map expense.title equals expense amount. That's where it actually showed when it got added in and when it had actually added in for each amount. And now going down here for the actual inside this widget, we had the charts that I had to add in actually for the registered expenses. This basically cleared all the charts and then added them in once they were actually displayed. That way it actually updated the chart every time. Now down here is where I actually implemented the carousel slider. So for this, I actually had to put it inside of a sized box and set the child to the carousel slider, which is what it needed. And basically the carousel slider just allowed it to actually be able to swipe through for the charts and the pie chart. So once you put that inside of a container using the inside the child and the size box, you basically just implement using pie chart, use data map, which is just for the string, the double, to actually be able to use that, as well as setting the chart radius to 200, just be able to make sure it actually fit on the screen. It didn't cause any pixels to overflow, as well as using the chart type, which was in enum, using the chart type dot ring. And for the chart value options, I set that as a constant just to make sure that it was actually passed correctly. And this is basically where I set it as there's two Boolean variables to actually show the chart value in the background and show the chart values as a percentage. Just set that as true. That way it actually shows up when you actually look at the chart value. And this was for the pie chart, so that making sure that everything in the pie actually pops up. So if this was set to false, then it just wouldn't actually show the background or the percentages that actually pumps up on the actual pie chart. This just set, so this is everything that got set in the pie chart. And right below here, this carousel was actually used for the just the entire idea of the carousel, being able to set the height to 800 to make sure it actually fit on the screen without overflowing, setting in for the enable infinite scroll just to set the true, reverse, that way just it's not set to actually go the other way, but if this was changed to true, then it would just basically you could swipe either way and it would work through. Autoplay I set to false, that way it just doesn't automatically swipe through every single time. But if you did set that to true, basically you would just set an actual duration right below, so it actually tell you how long it would take you to actually wait for it to actually swipe through and auto loop through it itself. And this is on the on larger factor, which is just set to 0.3, which is just how much the page needs to actually scale down. On the page I use the callback function. And for the scroll direction, I just had it go horizontal, so that way you click left to right, it would actually scroll through, or right to left, depending on if you implement reverse. And then instead of doing axis vertical, instead of swiping up and down. And after that, that's the end of the sized box, which is what fit everything in. That was basically what needed to be added inside of this body, because without the size box, then it wouldn't have actually been able to fit inside of this column widget. And that was everything that I used to actually implement these upgrades.